All right, I'll recap there. So the inspector shall inspect the service drop, the service entrance conductors, cables, and raceways, the service equipment and main disconnects, the service grounding, interior components of service panels and subpanels, conduct current protection devices, a representative number of installed lighting fixtures, switches, and receptacles, and ground fault circuit interrupters and arc fault circuit interrupters. We should describe the amperage rating of the service, the location of main disconnects and subpanels, the presence or absence of smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms, and the predominant branch circuit wiring method, i.e., is it knob and tube, etc. The inspector is not required to inspect remote control devices, test smoke or carbon monoxide alarms, security systems, or other signaling and warning devices. We are not required to test low voltage wiring systems and components, ancillary wiring systems and components, not a part of the primary electrical power distribution system, and solar, geothermal, wind, or other renewable energy systems. We are not required to inspect, to measure amperage, voltage, and impedance, and to determine the age and type of smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. So not required to do those items. That was it.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah.
So what does that mean?
If you want to ask me, sure. Obviously we're supposed to be looking for and testing the GFCI breakers or AFCI breakers. When I was reading this, I was initially thought surge protectors, but obviously the breaker would fall under overcurrent protection. So I don't go into great detail of identifying each particular item, but I am inspecting obviously the breakers that I can test and reset with the test button, and looking for any signs. I've only in a couple times found a surge protector that was identifying that there was some issue with it. So obviously put that in the report and make it a high priority item. Anything in my reports that's electrical related, even if it's a missing cover plate or something simple, I always try to make it a high priority, and let my clients know that some fixes are easy, but so anyway, to answer your question, that's how I handle it.
So the standard also talks about a representative number of installed lighting fixtures, switches, and receptacles. Kevin, I'm wondering, can you hear me?
Yes.
So Kevin, what does a representative sampling mean to you?
Representative sampling to me is to take my outlet tester and go to as many accessible outlets in every room possible. It takes me on a circuitous route around the house, which is every wall, where I'm also taking a flashlight, going against the ceiling. I'm testing the windows, but the outlets are what drive me around the room. And I'll point out to the clients where there's some that are inaccessible, but I will test as many as I can get. And that's, do you need me to elaborate, or is that, I'm looking for the limit to the question?
Yeah, no,
I think that's great.
That's helpful. Let me turn this down so I don't get the repeat. With the same idea, how do you handle three-way, four-way, five-way circuits, and do you try and run those down in every room to make sure those are functional?
I do not. What I say is that's a specialty electrical issue that should be addressed by a licensed electrician. And it's just because once I detect that something is amiss, I'm into troubleshooting. I need to report that something is wrong, and a licensed electrician needs to look at it at that point.
I guess more my question was, do you confirm the functionality of those multi-switch circuits?
I only to the degree that I don't see anything wrong as I'm switching them. So, I'm not, um, if, not making the, just running through the root operation of those. So if I'm throwing the switch and nothing's happening anywhere, then I'm questioning that, and I'll go to the next one and see if I can activate it. But I'm going as far as I can find something wrong, then I report it.
Got it. And then with the, along the same lines, how do you deal with exterior lighting, like floodlights on a house or landscape lighting that might be switched from inside the house?
For the most part, I use disclaimers about exterior 12, 24-volt wiring, and such as if a light bulb doesn't come on and the 120 volts up at the gutter, literally I'm just reporting that fact and have it further evaluated. And it depends on there's an escalation that's in the report. Basically, it's have further evaluated or have further evaluated by a licensed electrician. And I'll use my discretion on if it's the only thing I've seen in the electrical system that's bad, I'll say have further evaluated. If I find 5 things wrong with the electrical, I throw that in as a sack of things or a menu of things that an electrician needs to do.
Excellent, thank you.
Yeah, I think the photocells on a lot of floodlights can really
I
yeah.
carry Gorilla Tape with me, and I just, you can't use painter's tape because sunlight gets through. You gotta have the
Yeah.
black Gorilla
Oh,
Tape.
so you get up to every picture
No,
to
but
block them out?
the thing is, you gotta remember to go take it off.
Yeah, that's true. That's
Scott, when you do your inspections, are you actively testing ground fault circuits and tripping them with a tester?
Yes, I am. I actually use a tester, and I hit all the designated spots where you're supposed to have GFCI, and then even to the point of checking the washer one.
And then, do you ever have a situation where you test it and you don't hear where it did trip, now there's no power?
Correct.
Oh yeah, that's fun.
That's the fun
That's,
part.
that's
That's the fun
exactly.
part for
Now
sure.
you're
I mean,
the
there's
hunt
only
is on.
12 places it could be.
right.
Yes.
With that in mind, think, could you, Scott, describe a little bit where some of those places might be and how you might know that even before you went into a house? And I'll just throw out townhouses from the 80s or 90s and, tract housing from the 70s, and then any sort of new construction. Where are those secret spots going to be where the electricians hide the GFCI device?
What I found in some of the 70s and 80s houses, it was actually the wall receptacle near the kitchen cabinets and or next to an exterior door, let's say to the patio or balcony. And that was where the reset was. And it wasn't obvious. And it took, to your point, running up and down the steps many times to figure it out. But since I've identified that type of location, as well as the other one was in the, I've seen them in the garage, and that was also the trick. Now I go to those types of locations first when I can't find it. And then lastly, the one that was the most troubling was finding one that was actually outside at the back door. And that was the hardest one because everywhere else it was working, and it ended up being that outside one was the one that would reset everything.
I had a house today that was new construction that several circuits had redundant GFCI. So you would test one, lose power, can't reset it. You're like, well, now what do? I got to call the electrician and have him come over and reset the one that's upstream somewhere else that I tripped.
Yeah.
It's interesting that sometimes, at least with some of the new construction stuff, is that the message is everything needs ground fault circuits, but not everything needs an actual device that is GFCI, and oftentimes they'll end up putting them on, which then can create that sort of confusion.
Yeah, I think that's an indicator to me, especially like with a kitchen remodel, and you go in and then every outlet is a GFCI, and you're like,
Right.
All right. Well, this person was trying to follow, and it's his overkill, but it's also
As
it's
long
a
as they wire it correctly and the
it
trip is
could
reset.
correct,
Yeah.
correct. But often it was good intention, just wrong application.
So some of the things we're supposed to describe according to the standards are the amperage of the service, the location of the main disconnects and sub panels, the presence of smoke detectors and carbon monoxide. And then you and I were discussing before the wiring method. And we both looked
Right.
at each other a little cross-eyed and like,
That's-
well, I mean, like through the wall, through the
Interesting
floor,
term, right?
with a snake. I mean, well, and so because it was in italics, we both said, there's a definition. And the definition was really what kind of wiring was it?
Right. What type, I
right.
think, is
Yeah.
may have been
Yeah.
a better, but
I know that when I started, for some reason I had trouble with knowing the gauge of the wire just by looking at it. And so I carried a little like graph, and you could hold it up and be like, oh, that's a 4/0, that's a 2/0. I don't seem to have that trouble anymore. But some of the things that you might see in the older houses, and Larry, I'll ask you, when you're describing the amperage, how do you determine the amperage of the home?
Well, several ways. You look at the size of the service entrance conductors coming in, and you look for and you just determine whether they're aluminum or copper. And if you see 4/0, and it's aluminum and it's a 4/0, then you associate that with a 200 amp. But the first thing you're going to do, of course, is look at the breaker, the main breaker itself. And that's going to give you a good idea as to what size service you have. But then you want to make sure that they have the right size wire going to that service. And so, depending upon whether it's copper or aluminum, if it's aluminum, you're going to be looking for a 4/0. If it's copper, you're going to be looking for a 2/0.
Aluminum wire. Oh my gosh, you just told me there's aluminum wire in this house? Run away.
Well, for your main appliances
you
and
explained
for
your
your
appliance?
service, that's typical.
There's nothing wrong with it.
Nothing wrong with it. You want to look, see if there's an antioxidant on it. That's about the only thing I worry about. But of course, you always want to look at all connections to make sure you don't see any signs of overheating.
And with the service amperage rating, what's going to be the determining factor? Let's say you have, your service entrance cable, you've got your disconnect or your main panel with the disconnect built in, you've got the wire feeding it. Which one of those things is going to determine what the actual amperage
The
is?
smallest one. The smallest one is going to be the determinant. If you only have 2/0 aluminum coming in, you're not going to be able to turn that into a 400 amp breaker. So, it's going to depend. Now, also, I mean, if you really want to get down to it, you can also look at the rated panel size. If if the panel size is only rated for 150 amps, they better not be turning it into a 200 amp panel. I never saw that, but technically you want everything to match, and whatever's the smallest is what that service is going to actually be. And so if they're only running a 2/0 aluminum conductor and you have a 200 amp breaker in there, you're going to want to write that up as oversized breaker, main breaker.
What about the inverse? If I have a 4/0, is that a concern, going to like a 100 amp breaker as my main disconnect?
No, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But you, as long as it fits and it's rated for that panel, there's nothing wrong with that. But you can get more out of that panel by putting a larger breaker in there. But there may be a reason why they wanted to limit that size. So it may be worth investigating why that is.
And then one of the things we're also supposed to describe is the presence or absence of smoke alarms and carbon monoxide alarms. And Kevin, maybe you could help me with, I know there's a difference between alarms and detectors. And I'm not totally clear on which is which. And then in the same answer, maybe you could talk about whether you test these devices or how you assess their status.
That's a great question. I think for those of us who are outside of the state of Maryland, have a different approach to it. And those who are from New Jersey have a different approach to it. Being from New Jersey, um, we do not test the smoke alarms or carbon monoxide detectors. And that's because there was an agreement, and I think this should be state nationwide, but there was an agreement between the realtors, the home inspectors, and attorneys, so on and so forth, that it's best for all parties that the municipal fire departments with the $50, $75 contribution come in and test each alarm, making sure that they are up to current code, and they actually do a smoke test on them. Now, to go back to your question, in the state of Maryland here, it's different. It says that the sellers are responsible for the operation of the smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors, and they're also the last people that know that they are. It's kind of hidden away in the language of the contract that they're responsible, and that there's certain criteria that need to be met. Now, again, going back to the state of Maryland, and I'm going with my Philadelphia accent there, but the idea is that the testing and location requirements have changed 5 times in 10 years, with the last major change, I think, in 2018, but I'd have to ask Sean about that. And so I literally say in each report that they were not tested, that they should be tested. And I state the criteria of 2018, which is, sealed batteries or new units that are less than 10 years, or units that are less than 10 years old with sealed batteries. So I look at it as, from a home inspector's point of view, my point of view, that if you're going into the house and you test it, you're responsible for all those smoke detectors in that one house. And then you multiply it by the number of inspections that you do, and you are responsible, or you've made a statement that these things were working properly or they weren't working properly, need to be corrected. I think it's best to just stick with the standard that, hey, look, they all should be less than 10 years old. And I put one last very important criteria, which is, testing the smoke alarm by pushing the test button only tests the batteries. It doesn't tell you that you have a working smoke alarm. So that's prominent in my report. It's bolded in the report. And I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. I will oftentimes, if I can, uh, pop one off and get an idea of the date of it, just so I can tell my clients, and I'm gonna tell most of my clients, you should just put in new smokes when you move in. That way, you know what you've got and you're in control of who put them up and who's maintaining them. But it is sometimes helpful to know, oh, somebody actually did do that last year and you do have all brand new smokes, or in fact, I guess you don't really need to look at the back of one to tell if it's more than 10 years old.
Yeah, there should be obvious that there's at least no battery compartment. So that's a good giveaway that it's an updated one. But I think Kevin's got a good point of recommending that and you even said to be replaced. Just replace them, start fresh. And to answer your question about the difference between a detector and an alarm is, I mean, the detector is what's detecting the smoke. The alarm is what's making the sound. So when you hit that button, you're testing the alarm. You're not really testing the detector. They're both in one unit,
Right.
but I don't know. I just thought of it.
Scott, do you ever have your clients ask you, is it okay for that carbon monoxide detector to be on the ceiling, on the floor, in the middle?
Yes, I've actually had them ask. And in most cases, the answer is it should be at the height of approximately 5 feet. And that would be the area where most people would be if you're standing or walking through a hallway or in a bedroom, that would be appropriate.
So like in the breathing zone.
Exactly.
Yeah, I recommend people, if they're going to buy a freestanding unit, to get the ones that plug into an outlet, because and it may go against your 5-foot rule, but it's when people are sleeping, they're closer to the floor, and that's a better zone. I mean,
Is carbon monoxide heavier or lighter?
it's heavier, but very easily mixed. What's that? I thought it was heavier than ambient air.
It's actually just barely lighter, but not so light that it makes any difference.
So it just.
Right, it's easily mixed
it's
with-
Equally mixed with everything,
Well, with nitrogen, nitrogen and oxygen.
nitrogen.
Yeah, true.
I'm interested to hear some people's responses about what the inspector is not required to inspect. So, it says the inspector is not required to inspect remote control devices. I'm assuming we're not talking about televisions. I think we're talking about lights, window shades. What about kitchen hood? Sometimes kitchen hood has.
Really? I have
Ever seen those?
not,
Yeah, some of the ranges, the hood is so tall and it's hard to reach, and so they have a little plug in.
oh,
for the
okay.
remote. It
Okay.
doesn't actually plug in, it has two prongs and it sits in the outlet, but they're just,
I got you.
Placeholder.
Okay, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I don't see that very often.
Mini
Um,
splits.
What was your question?
so my question is, remote control device,
Oh, okay.
it says we're not required to inspect them, but do we?
I do for like ceiling fans and lights, when it's obvious that probably a light fixture has been converted to a fan, and so there's only one switch. Or you walk in and there's one switch and the fan nor light comes on, but you usually find it sitting on like a windowsill, or if there's furniture, it's gonna be on a dresser or next to like a nightstand. So that's between that application and a fireplace with a remote start.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question
Oh,
here. I mean, how do you test the fireplace?
Do you want to take this question? I mean, I'm happy to answer it, but I don't
No,
want to keep talking, but yeah.
Yeah. No, actually, for the fireplace and to your point around the exhaust over the range, I would test both of those with a remote. And the goal there is it's basically, I'll give it in my test, I'm gonna try 2 or 3 times with the remote. And if it doesn't work, I have a finding, remote inoperable confirmed. So the other thing that I ask is during the inspection, I'll ask the realtor if they're there and present, if they could contact the listing agent and get a picture that the fireplace was actually working and if the remote worked. So I try to balance that with the best due diligence I can do in kind of the moment. I
I think we lost Alan's mic.
do not. If the gas valve is off, I'm not gonna open the valve to turn it on. And I will write it up, gas valve in the off position or closed position. Yeah, confirm. Yep. And
Alan's mic is not working.
Might be batteries.
Yeah, I think it's batteries.
Yeah. I opened it tonight and there's 2 different batteries in it.
The question was window shades, to Larry. Larry, do you test window shades with the remote controls?
If it's a big mechanical contraption, yes. If there's a remote control for a window screen, yeah. I mean, for a window shade, yeah, sure, I would test it. And also for garage doors, if every now and then you'll use a garage door opener to test a garage door.
Right.
Those are the only, aside from the other ones that were mentioned, those are the only things I can think of that you would use.
Actually, my favorite remote control to find is when there's an awning for the deck. You don't have to sit there and crank the awning all the way up. That's a heck of a workout. So it's nice when there's a remote or even a wired switch for that.
Do you ever see the whirligig? There's like a little wind meter that's attached to those so that if you inadvertently leave the awning out.
It'll auto shut.
it'll
Yeah,
auto shut, yeah.
that's smart.
low voltage wiring systems, in some houses can actually be the whole lighting system. And while the standard says, you're not required to inspect those, the lights under the kitchen counter, the lights in the bathroom, the cabinet lights, all that stuff is low voltage lighting. I'm assuming no one out there in the inspection world is just writing out, it's a low voltage system, I'm not looking at it. I guess my question is, when do you decide that you're not looking at it? I guess I'll put this to Kevin.
Okay. We're talking about the low voltage system that was in the 60s, late 60s homes. I call them the RCA engineers home.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly one. There's also some of the Lutron ones are all low voltage with the actual switching.
Right. So when I got a 12 volt component, especially in the older ones where you basically have toggle switches instead of just up and down switches, there's usually a 12 volt transformer attached to every single one of those switches. And they're usually up in the attic and they're under insulation and they get hot. The insulation is right on top of it. So I'm not a fan. So when I see those, I basically say we need a licensed electrician to come in, evaluate evaluate the system, and make recommendations for possible conversion or update to current safety standards. And I leave it on the electrician because the wiring to those is also very small, undersized wire by comparison, proper size for 12 volt, but easy to become damaged by a rodent in the attic. Very easy. And not to mention the transformer burns out itself. So that's basically my attitude towards those pre-1975 ones from 60 to 75. And the neutron ones I'm not that familiar with. If somebody else wants to take that question.
How do you
The
track
thing I
lighting?
would say is in those situations, that's definitely where you're going to be able to lean on that you're not required to test it, because some of those ones where they're all pre-programmed, you're really going to evaluate it. You're going to start changing the program and having to reset
Right.
stuff.
I understand that.
I think
Okay.
that's
Yes.
the world of hurt.
I had one of those that actually went up in smoke and on my own house. Outdoor lighting.
Tray ceilings have low voltage lighting a lot of times.
That's tricky because you normally, well, at least I normally see those kind of systems in the very high end homes, especially the Lutron systems, or it's, I guess, especially like the turn of the millennium, if you will. That was really one of the fancy features with like Crestron remotes, and it was this automated home, everything, the TV from one remote, the lights. And you're right. I mean, you do want to aim to please with that level client, especially to make sure that you're evaluating as much as you can. You don't want to just kind of write it off, but you don't want to get into messing up a high-end system trying to figure it out. That doesn't go over well either. So,
Scott, what do you tell your clients when they say, do the speakers work? The whole house system, whether do the TVs work? Or
I'd just be very honest with them. It's not part of the inspection. And I offer 2 or 3 different contractors that specialize in home audio video, and they can contact them unless they have a provider. And then the other is simply, if that brand has the contractor's contact information that installed it, I point them to that. So I clearly don't take on the opportunity to try to learn the system or mess up anybody's pre-programmed system, particularly if the house is still occupied. And that's key.
yeah,
And
right.
if it was a vacant house and it's been staged, that's a different scenario where you might want to touch something like that. Right? But if it's occupied, absolutely not.
Well, and I think it's really important for all of us to remember that nowadays there are so many security systems that have listening devices, mics on. I was at a house this weekend, and the Ring camera outside talked every time I walked out on the front lawn. It said, "Hello, you're being videotaped." Hello, you're being videotaped. Wow, awesome.
Yeah,
I felt like saying, are you sure it's videotaped?
Yeah, right. I think one of the things I do try with my clients, if they ask about the speakers, I really try not to focus on them much, but some will say, how do you work this system? And I said, first of all, there's usually not a receiver there anyway, but
Right.
I'll say, as we're going around, there's some normal spots where the receiver might sit, but I'll let you know where I think the brains of the system would be where you hook up your amplifier receiver. And that usually is enough, but I tell
Right,
you,
like where all the
Can't
speaker
test it.
wires running back to.
right.
I will sometimes, if it's got a Bluetooth system, log in and start playing music.
Okay, that's nice.
Um, that's mainly when either I want to listen to it or I know that the client, it's really important to the client. Sometimes it's really easy, right? You can just go, oh, here's the system and now
Right.
I'm playing my music on it. Obviously, if you got to turn on somebody's Macintosh and make sure the tubes don't blow, you don't want to do that. With the same idea, ancillary wiring systems and components that are not part of the primary electrical power distribution system, I think is going to be like their landscape lighting, which oftentimes I think people just say, I don't inspect that at all. I mean, how do you deal with landscape lights?
I say I don't inspect them at all. And often they're on a photo cell. So you're gonna have to override and start testing. I mean, it's like irrigation systems. I mean, at that point, no, I do recommend, find out from the homeowner who, likely they have a company that services this. Depends on the caliber of the home, but, same thing with irrigation, but, no, I'm not gonna waste my time trying to go through all of that. I mean, if there's something obvious, like a switch, but a lot of times it's not even gonna turn on during the daytime.
Right. Right.
So one key point on the sprinkler system is I'm not going to activate it and I'm not going to go through the process. I will explain to the homeowner what it is
Oh,
and where that control panel is. But then the other is just simply, if I'm moving throughout the yard, checking on different things, if I find a damp area, I can point that out as this could be potentially an issue with the sprinkler head. You might want to have that looked at. So just helping in that way, but I'm really not inspecting it.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And actually, when I see that there's an irrigation system, I know in my mind part of the plumbing of the house is to make sure that there's signs that it's been winterized, or that it may be active, but there's going to be a backflow preventer, and if it's properly winterized, that there's going to be a missing backflow preventer on the outside. If it's inside, it's going to be set up to have been drained or whatever, lines turned off. So I do try to educate them on, if it's wintertime, find out who maintains this, and likely whoever winterized it, if it looks like it's been winterized, is going to be on the hook for it to be operational when it gets fired up in the spring. That's part of their winterization guarantee. Should be.
Well, this is an electrical discussion. So
I know,
we
sorry,
got-
but I'm just, that's part, it's low voltage.
It's low voltage.
Yeah, sorry.
Kevin, when you encounter houses with solar panels, what's your approach to solar panels? What do you tell your clients, and how far do you go with evaluating?
I see it as a segment unto its own that requires a specialist. I'm not that specialist, but I do almost the same language as I do with a swimming pool. That you want to contact the installer or a licensed installer and have them update any code or service advisories since the time of installation. And automatic transfer switches, those sorts of things that need to be verified that they're working properly. And I don't delve into that. So that's how I handle it.
And Larry, how about you? Evaluate solar systems, or how do you share that information with your client?
Yes, in my contract, when they're signing the contract, it says other areas not included in this inspection, and I actually write that in. I will not be inspecting the solar system, or depending upon what kind of generator system they have. If it's a real small, basic one, I might not be too intimidated by it. But if it's some real complex thing, I might throw that in there too, like, this inspection excludes the generator system or something, and I'll put, recommend that system be inspected by a properly licensed individual, something along those lines. You know,
So you don't count the number of panels and tell them how many kilowatts your system is?
right, I don't.
You don't look up underneath to see if the spill's gotten there?
I don't look up to see whether they've got enough storage capacity or how long it's going to last or any of that kind of stuff, or whether it can, well, but I do look for things like transfer switches. I want to make sure that they're not going to electrocute some local power company because they can't properly disconnect that thing when it's in use. I will definitely look for that.
Yeah. In our items not required to be inspected, it also includes geothermal, and I guess I just had a question for you that wanted to answer that. So, home has a geothermal heating and air conditioning system. Does that mean I don't have to inspect it? Or am I just saying I'm not inspecting the geothermal part, which is the part that's underground, which should already be covered by buried piping?
Right. I mean, yeah, if it's part of the heating and air conditioning, then that's the system that you do need to test, the actual equipment, but you can't.
It says here I'm not required to inspect the geothermal system.
Well, that's the minimal, I guess.
Well, we'll talk about geothermal when we get to heating and air conditioning. Has anyone ever seen a wind generation, a turbine in anybody's house actually making power? Interesting that's in there. I know that Sean often will actually get out his amp probe or his fluke or whichever brand he's using and measure amperage and even some resistance. Do you do any measurement of amperage on equipment when it starts up, Scott?
No, I do not.
You do any kind of troubleshooting where you're actually trying to identify the voltage or the amperage of a circuit?
No. Unless I'm using the tester for like GFCI and I'm plugging into a receptacle and I'm getting, let's say, reverse polarity or grounding. I would call that out, but I'm not using any tools or meters to gauge the actual voltage. Do you?
I often get called to do troubleshooting on stuff, so sometimes I'm doing that. I have run into a couple scenarios where you go through a house and you test the GFCI and it trips and everything, but when you actually measure like the voltage at it, there was like a dead leg of it. So even though the device did what it's supposed to do, it wasn't actually 120 volts behind. Wasn't sure why. It turns out somebody had hit it with like a nail.
Oh, I see.
If I get curious about something, I'll, if I run into a house and like every grounded outlet has got a different issue. And I've also been fooled by my testers sometimes where, some circuits, when they have the arc faults on them, you plug something in and it just trips.
Right, yeah.
And then you're like, well, is it that, I tried a different tester and that tester works fine. And some of them are just super sensitive to the way the blades are going in.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know what you're talking about. I wonder if I had my finger on the test button or something when I plugged it in.
So we're going to transition to our questions from the field. We're going to start with everybody's favorite. What are unsafe, defective distribution panels, and what are the inherent risks in each one? Larry?
Well, one of them, the obvious one would be the sub panel that only has 3 conductors running through it, or that does not have the neutral and the ground separated, because that can create a condition where you can have unwanted current on grounded surfaces.
So that's actually I think the next question, but I think what this one was more pointing towards was actual panel manufacturers.
Oh, like Federal Pacific,
Yes.
something like that. Yeah, yeah.
Since I'm looking at the list, but name four more.
Well, Federal Pacific is definitely on the list. Then there's ones like Zinsco that you have
Duolingo
oops.
unlocked just it's 9 p.m.
You have two different opinions on that. There are some people that say it's safe, some people that say it's not safe. But really, if the panel is very, very old, you definitely want to make some recommendations that it may be turned down by your insurance company pretty soon, and you might want to think about upgrading it, regardless of how old it is. But
Yeah, I often think that
you mentioned, right? I mentioned Federal Pacific.
if you're dealing with any of those panels, they're an old panel. And
Yeah, right, exactly. Oh, they're very old.
It's
Yeah.
time to upgrade that.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Um,
And if you see a lot of cloth wiring in the panel, you're going to want to make recommendations that this thing's probably going to flunk an insurance inspection in the near future. We have
so
in
speaking
Florida.
of cloth wiring, can you describe a little bit about what that material is actually made of and what are some of the challenges with it when you encounter it in an older house?
Well, I think it has asbestos in it, but I don't know if that really is part of the challenge. The challenge is, do you want to rewire a whole house? Because sometimes that cloth wiring can actually have pretty good rubber. The rubber insulation can still look good, It's just not going to be approved by insurance companies here in Florida. They're going to turn it down.
It's interesting. We don't have that situation here in Maryland where the insurance companies are getting that involved in what's in the house, I think.
Yeah, they're requiring what's called
That's
a
what I've heard of.
4 points inspection.
Not until after the house burns down, then they get involved. But
It's coming.
yeah,
So a couple of the other ones that were on the list were also the Pushmatic and the Bulldog panels, which are similar.
Yep.
I have not seen those in a while. I actually
No,
always kind of liked the styling and the architecture of it. I didn't really care for the actual functionality of it, but they looked cool.
Yeah, they had the Art Nouveau look.
Yeah. Federal Pacific panels, when people see those, do they just treat them all the same universally, or do you treat FP disconnects or fuse disconnects or different than the actual panels? I mean, is everything made by FP a problem?
I'm not aware that it is inherently. So, the stab locks. I mean, I'll take the cover off a stab lock panel. I know a lot of inspectors will immediately say, I'm not going to open myself. I've never had a breaker pop out at me. I've heard stories, but I definitely call it out in my reports, but
Somebody's
still
trying to
check.
show us a fused block FPE on their phone right now.
yeah. So I call it out, but I want to see what's going on with the wiring behind it as well. So let people know there's could be more than just a panel that's a problem.
So Scott, if you run into a Federal Pacific panel, what's wrong with them? Why are they such a concern?
It's actually the breaker design and the way it locks into the actual panel. So from that perspective, to your earlier question, the Federal Pacific panel and its design has been proven to create a potential for fire hazard. So from that perspective, what I refer the client to is, here's the issue. I actually state the litigation case that it was involved in, the lawsuit, and also provide them a website address where they can learn more if they wanted to. But the bottom line is that panel and that design is now in question. And what they would want to do is, I don't go to the point of have it evaluated. It needs to be looked at for replacement. and then a potential upgrade to the current design or panel. So that's the way I kind of coach and guide my clients in that particular situation. So while it does have a risk, the other thing that I state is this panel has been in place for, let's say, since the 70s. It's still working. And as we go throughout the house, we're still having the performance of the electrical functions and things are being grounded. So as of this moment, everything's still functioning. But now that you're aware of this risk, it's something that you need to consider and move on to a replacement option.
I would caution you against the word functioning, and that unless you actually tested the breakers. You're talking about defective breakers, and then you're saying that they're functioning.
I guess I was referring to functioning in the sense that the light switches were working. I could test a receptacle, not necessarily to the activation of a breaker. So good point, Hoff.
The rest of the electrical system was operating normally. There was no indication that something else was going
There
on.
wasn't a bad connection or.
Right.
I'd always heard that it was the 220 breakers, the double pole breakers that were the issue. And the only reason I bring this up is there's some condominiums and co-ops in DC that the whole building is wired with FPs, but they're all 110 circuits. There's no double pole, there's no 220 service to the unit. And sometimes you have a run where you go to a building like 4 or 5 times in a row because it's, being sold off, there's a lot of turnover or whatever. And, for a while I would tell them, well, this is a Federal Pacific panel and you need to replace it. And then they'd be like, well, we can't replace it. It's, it's the association's responsibility. They put their head in the sand, or they've hired somebody to come through and retrofit every panel. I'm not sure exactly how they did that.
Yeah.
The big
Yeah,
issue
I've seen,
with Pacific was their
high-end
cheating.
Bethesda, more than one. I can't think of the name right now. But right down there in the heart of Bethesda, downtown Bethesda, and basically every unit has the Federal Pacific. It's a smaller panel, but I've seen a few of those units have actually been upgraded to a newer panel, but most of them, and they all appear to operate properly. I don't go through and throw every breaker, but I do take the cover off and nothing's jumping out at me. So yeah, they're still out there and operating well.
Yeah, the reason they
So
were
Larry, you had
problematic-
touched on this earlier, but one of the questions from the field was, can someone please explain this thing about separating grounds and neutrals in a sub panel? Why does it matter? What can be done about it? Rephrasing the question, why should ground and neutrals be separated in this sub panel? That's a question to you, Larry.
Oh, okay. Well, because once you leave the service disconnect, you want to make sure that the ground and the neutral are separated, because if they come together later on, you can then put the neutral current onto all sorts of grounded surfaces. And if somebody gets in between that and a ground, they can pass current through themselves. And plus, it can interfere with all kinds of electrical devices and things. It's not a good condition. It can energize the frames of things like refrigerators and washing machines.
So your appliances are can be electrified.
Yeah, because you're now passing. You have your hot wire and your neutral wire, and they're both carrying current. But if the neutral current, if that neutral current carrying conductor comes in contact with that grounding, your equipment grounding conductor, it's going to allow that current to flow along there, because it doesn't take the path of the least resistance. It takes all paths, and it flows mostly maybe on the least resistance, but it's flowing through all paths. So the problem is when the main path, the main neutral of that particular circuit gets interrupted, then all of a sudden that grounding conductor becomes a heavy current carrying conductor. And if somebody interrupts that and grabs both ends of it, they can get pretty shocked. So, and if you come in contact with a refrigerator that's got, its external shell is now receiving current, and you touch the water faucet, you might get shocked.
Especially on the 240s. Yep. That's, yeah. Electric range.
And where you see a situation like that popping up a lot is when people will take the 240 circuit to an air conditioner, and they'll put an outlet. They'll run an outlet off of that now, and they're using that ground because there's no there's no neutral wire in that, and they'll turn that ground wire into a neutral. And now all of a sudden, whatever you're plugging into that is, it's just not a good situation.
I'm drawing a blank on another issue with grounds and neutrals, and not only why they're important, but how they're sometimes they're easy to overlook, I guess.
So the things you want to be looking for in a sub
I'll
panel.
move on.
Still play.
Polarity?
But
Kevin, what is reverse polarity, and why should I care?
Well, gosh, I've heard it explained several times. I used to ask electricians, every electrician I've met, what it was, and they couldn't really adequately explain it. So for one electrical engineer said, think of it as a table lamp. You have a table lamp and it's got a switch that turns the power on, and the switch will break the circuit when you turn the power off. In the scenario of reverse polarity, you've actually turned off the neutral, but you've not turned off the power to the socket. So literally you go to change the light bulb, you get a shock off of that because you think the light has been, the power is off because you've turned the switch. But that only happens in correct polarity. In reverse polarity, the power is still running to the socket. Now that's the one I've kind of accepted. I don't know of electrical theory about that. It was only an electrical engineer who taught me that part. And I pass it on to my clients. And it's like a parable in a larger story. It gets the point across that this is not correct and that you should have this corrected right away. And part of what I'm here is to tell you that these things exist on different circuits in the house if I come across it. That's what I use as my analogy.
Yeah, I use that same metaphor, and I found it very effective because people can immediately picture that and the socket and go, oh, yeah, well, let's get that fixed. I also tell them that sometimes certain devices won't like being plugged in reversed.
Motors.
So how does reverse polarity end up in a house? And I guess there's a couple of different ways, Scott. So we'll start with new construction. You go through a house, you're testing your representative number of receptacles, and then you hit one that's got reverse polarity, and like, well, how in the world can this be, right? I mean, they're black and white, they go in the same spots on every circuit.
Right. So we got a comment earlier when you use that phrase representative number, where someone pointed out to us that Virginia doesn't use the term representative number. They're looking for every single one. That's what Virginia calls for, everyone that's accessible. Just to put a fine point on it. But go ahead, Scott.
So in terms of the new construction and where you might see that is, sometimes they're turning the receptacle, quote unquote, the opposite way we're used to seeing it, where the ground prong is on the top, and they might do that to locate the switched receptacle in that, let's say, bedroom. And in that case, that could be an example where they're creating the reverse polarity because they reverse the way the orientation of the receptacle. And then the other would be, I'm just going to say it, poor quality in terms of they're racing through to get things done, and they just finish it up and be done when they actually connected it wrong. And it's surprising how often that occurs in the new construction. At least for me, I'm seeing that oftentimes just in the dining room area and outside the kitchen because of so many GFCI connections, as well as in, let's say, a butler's pantry area outside the kitchen. That's where I'm seeing those reverse polarities.
Yeah, me too. Mark, you often see them in an older home, and sometimes you'll be going through the house and testing outlets, and all fine. Then you get to the panel and you realize the house has got two wire, no ground anywhere, but yet everything's testing correctly. Am I making sense there? And I guess the inverse is what I'm talking about, is that you'll go into a house that's got all grounded outlets and every single one's reading reverse polarity. And it may not actually be reverse polarity. It's that they've wired the outlet to try and make it a grounded outlet, but they can't because there's no ground.
Oh, I see what you're saying. So like converting an old two-prong outlet
Yeah,
and then having a little jumper for it. Yeah, I mean, I don't see that often, but I typically equate that to somebody just not installing the outlets properly, more of a DIY or often when I see that, I just assume that they had a handy person in there or somebody just enough just to make it work, but maybe not get it right. So, but easy fix. In the grand scheme of things.
another thing on the list of things you didn't have to inspect are generators. And I'm curious, and I'll use the five of us here. I'll start with Scott. Scott, do you test generators on houses that have them?
No, and the reason being is the generator has a failover system, so the electrical would have to convert to that and then fail back to the house. And that's again outside of what I want to be responsible for. So, but what I do is I'm looking for the breaker identification in the panel, the appropriate manufacturer panel for, let's say, the generator, and then the let's say the generator service entrance cable penetrates a concrete basement wall. I'm looking to see how that was processed through that wall, if it has a channel or a casing around it. And then next would also be, is the generator on a pad, for example? And then what type of generator is that? Is it a fuel source generator that has a separate tank? So I would note the underground storage or whatever might be the case for that particular generator setup. So I describe the generator configuration, but I'm actually not testing the generator.
So you're telling your client what they have and what they can expect and
Yes.
what they need to do with it.
Exactly. And then similar to how I would describe their propane service to the house, I would say they need to contact that provider and confirm the service agreement and so forth with that to continue utilizing that generator.
Scott, or excuse me, Kevin, what's your approach to generators?
Yeah, I want to be as arm's length from that generator as possible. For what we've just heard, but also just because I don't know all the potential defects with the generator. And if I did, I'd be considered an expert in that field. And I'd rather tell them up front, I'm not an expert in this field and you need one. Just for a day-to-day operation. And again, you don't want to damage anything if you don't have the knowledge. So I like the idea of leaving that alone, but that's just my approach.
And Larry, how about you?
Yeah, I write it out in the contract. But like I said, if I see something that I know is going to be very unsafe, I will make a note of that and have them get an electrician to fix it.
Yeah, I tell my clients it's important to have those things serviced every year, right? Because it's the small engine, it's got a variety of parts that do need replacement, and you need it to work when it needs to work. But I will test generators. I'll throw the power. I'll figure out sort of how it's configured. And sometimes I won't, just because I don't want to, I get into a house and I know that regardless of how smart it is, dropping all the power is going to screw up something and I'm not going to be able to get it reconfigured. On some of the older generators, you couldn't run it, you couldn't test it outside on the unit because you'd erase the exercise time and you'd have to go and reset it. But that doesn't seem to be the case anymore. If they're open, I'll just fire them over, see if they actually start, and I'll look for the last service date. Because if it's been serviced regularly, then there's a sticker somebody's been on it. If it hasn't been serviced in a while, it's going to be pretty obvious as to what the issues are there. Mark?
Well, I basically, I don't try and test the system. I do look, as Scott was talking about, the configuration, and but one of the important parts, and I think we've all agreed is to educate the buyer that they need to find out it may be obvious who's maintaining it, but it likely is under some kind of a service agreement, hopefully, and any kind of information, just like the irrigation or low voltage lighting or a pool. So all those components, but I really try not to mess with them because I don't want to be responsible for messing something up.
In getting ready for tonight, I did look up a couple of things, and I found this one. I found Mike Holt's electrical forum, and an inspector had gotten on there and asked all the electricians, what are the things that you get called to a house for that the home inspectors are identifying where the inspector is actually wrong? And they had this whole list of things, and some of them were like, well, that's, inspector told him to call you because there was an issue with it. But they were all pretty open to his questioning, and they provided a lot of good feedback. I don't have anything really excellent to share, but it was interesting the way he approached it was to sort of just put himself out there and say, hey, I want you to tell me what it is what sort of false calls you're getting that, we can maybe head off on the home inspector side. So maybe next time we'll have that. Hollis, do we have any questions from the field that are in the chat there?
Yeah, Alan, one of the things, speaking of inspectors calling out something, I always wonder, like in the main panel where before, you could have neutrals and grounds bonded together on the same screw, and now they want you to have the neutrals separated with their own dedicated screw. And I know that that's a current standard now. That is code, the best safety practice. Is it a reason to immediately have an electrician come out and convert that when someone moves in? I tend to steer my clients to say, look, once you get into having an electrician out here, this is something that would be wise to have addressed, or at least ask the electrician, is this worth fixing? I would imagine some electricians would be like, it's fine, but many may say, yep, let's go ahead and do that. Would you call that a dire rewiring?
I'm only calling that out if the panel's like overcrowded or there seems to be some other issue. But yeah, I mean, panels that were wired 20 years ago have gang neutrals all over them. And
Okay. Do you note it?
I know I have a checkbox for
Okay.
gang neutrals, and when I think I have something that says when there's like excessive.
Sure. Yeah.
Don't ask me to define excessive, but
Yeah.
depends on the
That's
day.
okay. All right. That was one thing. I am pretty strict on a lot of electrical things, and this one I don't water down, but I also don't. Yeah, I guess it's probably one of the few things that I tell my clients, you should have someone look at it, but
When you have a service disconnect on the exterior of the home, do you tell your clients that, this is how somebody can come and turn the power off, and you should put the little lock on here so that they can't do that?
yeah, yes, it is an easy way to
Whenever I show clients that disconnect, they're always like, "Wait, somebody can just come turn off the power?" I'm like, "Yeah."
Yeah, technically.
That's there though to protect firefighters.